The war had ended, but for Thomas Elwood, silence was the only thing that followed him home. He stepped off the train at a small rural station in Wiltshire, boots still caked in mud from France. His uniform hung loose on him, too big now after months of hunger and exhaustion. Villagers cheered as other soldiers reunited with loved ones, hugs, tears, laughter, but Thomas just stood there, his duffel at his feet, staring at the countryside that once felt like another world. No one greeted him. His father had died before the war, his mother had fallen ill in 1917. The Elwood farmhouse still stood beyond the fields, but it looked smaller now, its roof sagging under the weight of years. He walked toward it slowly, every step feeling heavier, as though the battlefield mud still clung to his bones. Inside, the house smelled of dust and memories. The clock ticked faintly on the mantel, each sound sharper than the gunfire that still echoed in his mind. He dropped his duffel on the floor and sat by the window, watching the evening light fade into grey. Outside, the fields were empty, the world peaceful. Inside, his mind replayed the trenches, the screaming, the smoke, the faces of men who would never come home. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like artillery in the distance. He woke gasping, clutching at his chest, until he remembered he was home. He was safe. But the silence of safety was louder than the war. The next morning, he walked into town. People recognized him, Thomas Elwood. Back from France, eh? God bless you, son. But their voices blurred together. He nodded, forced a thin smile, and kept walking. Every time someone clapped him on the shoulder, he flinched, his body tensing before he could stop it. He reached the edge of town, where the church bells rang for Sunday service. Rows of villagers filed inside, some wearing black for sons and brothers who never returned. On the memorial wall outside, freshly carved names gleamed in the sunlight. Thomas traced his fingers over them. James, Robert, Henry. He knew them all. He'd watched them fall. At the bottom of the list, a new name had been added, Private Thomas Elwood. He froze. His own name, etched in stone. The villagers must have assumed he was dead. For a long time, he stood there, staring at the letters. He wasn't supposed to be here. The thought felt heavier than his uniform. When the bell stopped, he sat on the church steps, his breath visible in the cold air. Children played nearby, laughing, chasing one another across the square. He wanted to smile, to feel something, but he couldn't. The laughter reminded him of men joking in the trenches before the morning barrage, moments before everything went silent again. That night, he went back home and took out his old journal, its pages water-stained and torn. He hadn't written since the summer. He opened to the last entry, hold the line. Henry says we'll be home by Christmas. Henry never made it home. Thomas stared at the blank page that followed. The pen trembled in his hand. Words wouldn't come. So he closed it again and stared into the quiet. Days turned into weeks. He tried working the fields, repairing the fences, feeding the chickens. But his hands shook too much. The sudden bang of a drop bucket made him dive to the ground. The whistle of wind through the barn made him flinch as if shells were incoming. One evening, the local priest came by. "Thomas," he said gently, "you haven't come to service." "I've had my fill of prayers, Father." "Then talk to me instead." Thomas looked away. "I buried too many to talk." The priest hesitated. "You're alive. That's something to be thankful for." Thomas gave a bitter smile. "Am I?" The priest left a candle burning by the window before walking away. Thomas watched the flame flicker against the glass, trembling like his own thoughts. That night, He dreamed of the trenches again, mud, gas, screaming, and woke up shouting into the darkness. He ran outside, barefoot, into the cold field. The stars overhead looked sharp, almost violent in their beauty. The world was too still. He fell to his knees, pressing his hands into the dirt, and finally the words came, broken sobs, half-remembered prayers, the names of his friends whispered into the night. It was the first sound he'd made since coming home. When dawn came, the candle still burned faintly in the window. He walked back to the farmhouse and sat at the table, breathing slow, steady. Then, for the first time in months, he picked up his pen and began to write. Not about the war, not about death, but about silence. About coming home. Thomas's words began as fragments, memories that bled onto the paper like ink from a cracked pen. He wrote of mud and rain, of the endless rhythm of boots in the trenches, of the quiet moments between shellfire when the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. He didn't write for anyone else. He wrote to survive. The journal became his only friend. Each night he'd sit by the window, candle flickering, filling page after page. Some nights he wrote until dawn. Other nights he simply stared at the blank paper, too afraid of the memories that waited to spill out. Yet with every sentence, the heaviness in his chest lifted, grain by grain, like sand slipping through an hourglass. Word spread through the village that Thomas was writing again. The priest would visit sometimes, leaving food at the door. He never asked questions, never pressed him to speak. Once, he found a note pinned to the basket, "Words can heal where prayers cannot." But healing was slow. Winter came early that year. Frost painted the windows and turned the fields white. Thomas barely felt the cold. He'd rise before dawn, walk to the churchyard, and stand before the memorial wall. His name was still there, Private Thomas Elwood, etched beneath those who had truly died. He'd trace the letters each morning, wondering if, in some way, the man he used to be had died out there. Maybe what came back wasn't the same person. Maybe the real Thomas Elwood was still lying in that trench, buried beside Henry and the others. One day, a voice broke the silence. "You're him, aren't you?" He turned to see a girl, no older than 15, holding a basket of poppies. "They said you were dead," she said softly, eyes wide. "But you came back." "I suppose I did," he murmured. "My brother didn't," she said, her voice trembling. "He was in France. I bring him flowers every week." Thomas looked at the poppies. Their color burned against the gray sky. What was his name? Peter. Peter Wells. He nodded. "I remember him." The girl blinked. "You do?" "He was with us at the summer. Always carried a tin of toffee in his pack. Said he'd open it when we made it home." Her lips trembled. Did he suffer? Thomas hesitated, then shook his head gently. "No. It was quick." She smiled faintly through her tears. "Thank you." After she left, Thomas stood for a long time staring at the name Peter Wells. He told her what she needed to hear, not what was true. But maybe mercy was a kind of truth. That night, he opened his journal again. His handwriting was steadier now. He wrote about Peter, not how he died, but how he lived. The jokes, the laughter, the small kindnesses that made hell bearable. He realized he could remember them not as ghosts, but as people. By spring, his journal was nearly full. The priest asked to read a few pages. Thomas agreed. Days later, the priest returned, eyes red-rimmed. "These should be read," he said quietly. "Others need to understand what it was like." Thomas shook his head. "They don't want to know." They want to forget. Perhaps, the priest said. But forgetting is another kind of death. That night, Thomas sat by the fire, staring at the flickering light. The silence didn't hurt as much anymore. It was no longer the silence of death, but of peace. Weeks later, he went to the village printing press and left his journal there. No title, no author's name, just pages bound together. Months after that, people began reading it. The papers called it the letters of a silent soldier. Farmers, teachers, widows, they all spoke of the boy who came home but could not speak, and somehow gave them words for their own grief. Thomas never claimed it. He didn't want to. He simply kept writing, day after day, filling new pages, trying to make sense of the war that refused to end in his mind. Years passed. The world moved on. But in that quiet farmhouse, a single candle still burned by the window each night. And somewhere in the fields of Wiltshire, when the wind was soft and the night was still, it was said you could hear the faint scratching of a pen, the sound of a boy who came home in silence, and finally learned to speak. The years passed quietly, but the war never truly left Thomas. It lived in the corners of his mind, not as a raging storm anymore, but as a whisper. Sometimes, when the wind swept through the valley and the trees groaned in the dusk, he could almost hear the low hum of distant artillery. The sound no one else heard. By 1920, the village had begun to heal. The fields grew green again, the church bell rang brighter, and laughter returned to the square. Children who had once hidden from the sight of soldiers now played war in the meadows with sticks for rifles and tin pots for helmets. Thomas would watch them from a distance, half smiling, half hurting. One morning, he found a letter at his door. The seal bore a government crest. Inside, the words were simple. The Ministry of Pensions requests your attendance at the War Office in London for reassessment and testimonial. He almost burned it. But something in him, maybe curiosity, maybe a lingering sense of duty, made him go. London was louder than he remembered. Carriages and motorcars clattered through the streets. People hurried past in polished shoes, their laughter sharp and bright. Thomas felt like a ghost drifting through a world that had forgotten the dead. At the War Office, he sat across from a man in a clean uniform who smelled of tobacco and ink. The officer asked questions mechanically: name, regiment, injuries, length of service. Thomas answered them all in a quiet voice. "Do you have any ongoing conditions?" the officer asked. Thomas hesitated. "Only memories." The officer didn't smile. "I meant physical ailments." Thomas looked down. "No." When the interview ended, the officer stamped his papers and dismissed him. On his way out, Thomas passed a young recruit in the hallway, barely 18, clean-shaven, full of pride. The boy saluted him. Thomas nodded but couldn't bring himself to return it. He walked out into the London rain. As he crossed Trafalgar Square, he noticed a group of men huddled beneath the steps. Their uniforms were torn and faded, soldiers, beggars now. One of them looked up and met Thomas's gaze. His eyes were hollow, but alive. "You fought too?" the man asked. Thomas nodded. "Then you know," the man said. He didn't ask what he meant. They both knew. He gave the man his last coin, then turned and walked toward the station, the rain washing over him. When he returned home that night, the fields were covered in mist. The candle still burned in the window. He sat by it, soaked and shivering, and for the first time in months, he began to write not about war, but about peace. What peace meant. What it cost. He wrote about the laughter of children in spring. About the quiet mornings when the dew clung to the grass. About the smell of bread from the bakery in town, the tolling of the church bell, the feel of sunlight after a storm. He wrote about life because that was what the dead had given up for him to have. The journal grew thick again, filled with pages of hope and loss, darkness and light. Each entry felt like another breath returning to him, slow, painful, but real. In 1922, on Armistice Day, Thomas stood again before the memorial wall. Villagers gathered around with wreaths and poppies. The priest read the names aloud, one by one. When he reached Private Thomas Elwood, the priest paused, then looked up. Thomas stepped forward. "You can leave it," he said quietly. "It belongs there." No one spoke. A few of the older villagers nodded in silent understanding. The priest simply bowed his head. That night, Thomas walked home through the cold air. He no longer felt like a ghost. The silence that once haunted him now felt sacred, as if it were the voice of every man who never came back. Years later, when Thomas grew old and grey, the farmhouse remained the same. Dust gathered on the shelves, but the candle still burned every night. Children from the village would sometimes visit, curious about the quiet man who wrote stories of war and peace. He'd sit them by the fire and tell them small things about friendship, courage, laughter amid chaos. Never the horror, only the humanity. And when they asked him, "Was it scary, Mr. Elwood?" he'd smile faintly and say, "Yes." But what mattered wasn't fear, it was what we did despite it. When Thomas Elwood died in 1954, the villagers found dozens of journals stacked neatly by his bedside, thousands of pages chronicling the voice of a generation that had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in its worth. He was buried beneath the memorial wall where his name had once stood among the dead. And each year, on November 11th, the townspeople would light a single candle by his grave. A tribute to the boy who came home in silence and taught the living how to listen.